2023.
Okay, so this is brand new,
That's right.
and you're looking at 223 more being done in how long?
You know, that's a very good question. It does depend upon the pace at which communities wish to proceed. So that is in their hands.
They're the ones that move the needle?
That indicates, so Section 20 of the Act, there's two mechanisms for them to sort of signal whether they wish to proceed to assert jurisdiction or wish they want to do it via a coordination agreement. So they have those two mechanisms, and yes, that is under the community's control.
This would represent, when you say 223 plus 7, so 230, there's 600 and some 30 nations in the country. This takes a long time for these ones. We still have 2/3 of the nations that have not entered this process.
That's right.
That's
Done.
the end of the time. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. East, who has 5 minutes.
Thank you. In July 2020, the Assembly of First Nations and the Government of Canada signed the protocol concerning the implementation of the Act of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Children, Youth, and Families. Now, among other of the protocol aims to, and this is in quote, inform a process for collaboration and cooperation with First Nations peoples on regulations supporting implementation of the legislation. I have two questions on that. Firstly, how are we ensuring First Nations participation when we're going through the initial stages of this process? And can you also talk to us a little bit about why there's a need for regulations during this implementation? What do we anticipate the regulations, when does the department anticipate the regulations will be developed?
Thank you for that. I'll turn to my colleague, Ms. Cantel.
Thank you for the question. Regulations are a tool that could be used to reinforce some element of the legislation. Other elements can also be developed that, are outside the regulation, let it be guidance or policies that could be helping this. One of the elements that we will be doing is, as you know, in the legislation, it mentions that there is a mandatory 5 years review. We will be engaging with partners, like communities, at the community level, at the NIO's level, with provinces and territory as well, to see what kind of amendment or improvement they could see in the legislation. Regulations will also be discussed in that engagement process. So far, what we have learned pertaining to regulation is there might be a need pertaining to the minimum standards, and it's in their application. So we will see, once again, this is going to be co-developed, and it will be what we will be hearing from partners that will, get moved forward.
Okay. So does anyone else want to talk about the participation of First Nations as part of this moving forward, the collaborative process?
I mean, certainly the legislation was co-developed, and the plan is to continue co-development of its implementation. That's certainly been our approach, and that's what we'll continue to do.
So in the final 2 minutes that I have, we've got this Supreme Court ruling, we have funding in place, but as pointed out, processes. How can we make sure that we're getting the funding to the communities that need them right now? I mean, I know that it's not always a process of going fast is what the federal government does, but what can we do better to ensure that we're getting the money to the communities that need them? Is there a way that we can make it more flexible for communities to access this money before they have to go through this? Like, what is the obstacles that are there, and how can we make sure that we're getting the funding to the communities faster?
That's a great question. My colleague referred to the 5-year review of the legislation, and I think the best answers to those questions often come from communities in terms of what they've learned along the way. So just recently, and several months ago, Louis Bull Tribe did host, a forum on lessons learned about using C-92 as a tool to enact jurisdiction. And so we are trying to make sure that we always listen to those lessons around, is capacity building broad enough? Does it do enough? Does it answer all of our questions? And then also we really see, as we often see with these types of initiatives, the strength of communities helping each other to figure out, this is what we did, here's where we found it challenging, here's what worked really well, to try and make that always as smooth as possible.
And with that being said, would you say that there's some best practices out there with which nations or tribal organizations that are actually have gone through this process and are now receiving the funds that can help other nations along this journey?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that we've really seen that communities are starting to talk about wanting to have more opportunities to share those best practices, and those conversations, I think, are happening across the country. We hear that very frequently.
Can you name a few that, just if someone's watching and saying, which community is getting this right? How have they been able to access the money so quickly?
I mean, I think that there's the, like, I don't think there's any getting it wrong or getting it right. It's like doing what makes sense at a given moment in time. I think we've seen huge success at Peguis First Nation around reducing the number of children coming into care. We've heard that from their leadership. I know Louisville Tribe has been very happy to share its experiences around, putting the act into place. I think, Splatseen First Nation as well, doing a lot of incredible work. And across those coordination agreements, we've seen tremendous success. And it's also, what's really encouraging about it is the pace at which that change can happen when communities have been able to put this into action.
And are we offering with Assembly of First Nations the ability for those communities to pass on that knowledge to other communities interested in going down this route?
I mean, certainly in terms of the capacity building funding, we do support the Assembly of First Nations, yes.
And now we'll go to Monsieur Lemire for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thank you, Mr. Chair. In your departmental plan 2023-24, Indigenous Services Canada says the following. There's a risk of uncertainty about the interpretation of the legislation of the Act, and that could lead to frustration and compromise the relations with Indigenous partners, provinces, and territories. And we've been observing for a long time now that great sums of money have been going back to the Treasury. Can you tell me how that could be prevented, and how can we make sure that Indigenous peoples and communities can manage their new responsibilities so that they can really meet the real needs of their communities? How can they have an easy access, and ultimately that these amounts do not go back to the Treasury, which happens quite often when we're talking about sums of money sent to Indigenous communities? We have to develop their communities. They are asking for this, of course, especially First Nations in Quebec and Labrador have been saying that. And the answer has been quite vague about the amounts that have been made available and the negotiation procedures. So that's frustrating, and that could compromise the relations between the partners. So what measures are you thinking about implementing to answer and this need and meet the real needs of the communities? Thank you for the question. We have to face this criticism with flexible long-term financing that is managed by the communities themselves. So I'm fully aware of this sort of criticism, and there are very onerous administrative burdens, but we are trying to overcome with the situation with subsidies, and that is always part of the coordination agreements. These are long-term agreements, and there's internal flexibility to allow the communities to prioritize where they are going to spend the amounts, and that they can introduce prevention measures as well. Thank you for this long-term vision. I think it is fundamental. It is really desired and requested, and this ruling, of course, gives the charge of allowing for this at the end of it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Perfect timing. And no, we'll go now to Ms. Gazan for the final 2.5 minutes.
Thank you so much. I just want to clarify. I mean, it's often said that it's at the pace that communities want to go. I just want to clarify it's not really at the pace. I don't think we've ever not wanted jurisdiction over our kids. It's about the funding and resources that are providing to give back our human rights and uphold UNDRIP so that we can care for our kids. Going to the fall economic statement 23-24, the department plan sunset of funding includes budget 2021 for mental health and wellness. Specifically, though, funding from budget 2019 for continued implementation of Jordan's principle and supporting Inuit children, and funding to support individual compensation, capital expenditures, and immediate reforms of First Nations Child and Family Services and Jordan's principle. So what I find odd, we talk about Bill C-92, still no kind of plans for money. Jordan's principle keeps kids alive in my community, even though it's often not provided or given out in a timely manner in terms of service providers. That is sunsetting. I put forward amendments to EI to make sure that EI regimes would be consistent with how we choose to care how we choose to care for our children as an affirmed right in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It seems that there's no consistency with this government on when it's going to uphold the rule of law when it comes to Indigenous human rights, particularly in relation to our children, depending on what legislation it is, or when it isn't going to do that. And what concerns me about that is that if there isn't a plan for total legislative reform, is this government really serious about implementing UNDRIP? Because we can't change things if people don't want to pay for it. There's a cost to violent colonization. One of the violent costs is the fact that we have an overrepresentation in the child welfare system. Is there any plan to make sure that legislation is consistent to affirm our right to have self-determination over the care of our children, whether it's EI, Jordan's Principle, or Bill C-92?
Thank you. I'll defer to my justice colleagues around that.
What I can speak to is the UN Declaration Action Plan, which has over 180 measures, and within that there are a number of potential legislative measures and the act itself, the UN Declaration Act that I think you mentioned earlier, as well as the first priority in the UN Declaration Action Plan, requires the government to create a process to ensure laws are consistent with UN Declaration.
Be done within 2 years, and it's gone much past the 2 years. That's
We
the
are out of
problem.
time, so I'd say just finish up your response briefly, and then we'll need to finish. Okay, thank you. So with that, we are out of time, and I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here with us this morning. It's been a good discussion. There are a number of questions that we have asked, and members have asked for follow-up, and so we'll be getting those questions to you, and I would encourage you to get them back to us as soon as you can. With that, colleagues, we are going to suspend, and for anybody online, I'll ask you to, as quickly as possible, log back in to the in-camera link that was sent to you, and then we have committee business that we'll be returning, so we'll suspend for a few minutes and get back in as soon as we can. Thank you. Meeting suspended.